Hello, everyone, and welcome to Change the Air Foundation's very first interview, first of many, I hope. My name is Kendra Seymour, and today we're going to be talking about something very important, the role of mold and water damage and what it plays in our homes and buildings, and most importantly, what we can do about it. So if you know or suspect you might have a mold issue, maybe you've had some water damage in the past, maybe you have some unexplained health symptoms, or maybe you just want to make sure that the air you're breathing in your home is healthy for you and your family, then today's episode is for you. That said, I'm very excited to welcome our first guest, Brian Karr. Welcome, Brian.
Hey, how's it going? Number one, this is exciting. I like it.
I know. We'll have to bring you back at all the hallmarks, 50, 100, that kind of thing.
Yes.
For those who don't know Brian is a second generation indoor environmental consultant who specializes in working with hypersensitive individuals with complex medical conditions. He helps them understand if mold, mycotoxins, and other indoor pathogens exist in their homes and how they may be contributing to their health conditions and how to remedy those. Karr has become a go-to mold and biotoxin resource for many medical practitioners across the country and has helped over 5,000 hypersensitive individuals nationwide to create healthier living environments that have allowed their doctors to help them get better. Karr is co-founder of We Inspect and creator of Mold Finders Method, a digital training program developed for hypersensitive individuals and doctors who treat them. The program teaches its students how to identify and remove mold and mycotoxins from their homes so they can get healthy again without having to hire or get scammed by a local inspector. And we are also very lucky at Change the Air Foundation because Brian is one of our strategic advisors.
Wow.
Now, Brian, I know
that is way too long.
I love it. And I know you've helped more than 5,000 people. Your podcast is great. And I know it's helped so many individuals and families out there.
Oh, thank you.
I want to get right to it though. So for those joining us, we may be in different parts in our journey. And my first question to you is, what is the first thing we should do if we see or suspect mold or water damage in our homes?
Oh, okay. So, it's hard. So if you're seeing mold or you're seeing water damage, right? It's almost like two things. I think sometimes people look at it differently, like, oh, I don't see mold here, this isn't a problem, right? Versus, oh, I see mold here. It's funny because when we say I see mold, it's almost like we think that we know what mold looks like, and therefore I have definitively said that this is mold and this thing over here is not. And it doesn't really work that way, right? So I would almost change it a little bit and be like, what's the first thing that you do if you suspect that there is a mold problem? Not if I'm seeing it, if I'm not seeing it, but if I'm just suspicious of it. And that means areas where you maybe aren't even seeing it, right? There are people that get feelings in certain places, like, I just feel like something's going on over here. Or I had this big water pipe leak or something, and I don't see anything, but you've got symptoms, this or that, what do you do, right? And I think that's kind of the main difference in the approach and how you go after it. And honestly, the very first thing, if there's ever a water issue, you stop the water, right? So hopefully what we're talking about now, it's more of something that's happened that you're suspicious. But step one is always stop the water if there is a leak or something going on. Mm-hmm. Now, the thing about mold is it only takes 24 to 48 hours to grow. So a lot of times someone will say, oh, I had this leak over here, or I suspect this thing over here. Well, it's dry now, or when we dried out this cabinet thing that happened, we had fans on it for 3 or 4 days or whatever. 3 or 4 days is long enough, right? Mm-hmm. So we think that we addressed it by drying it out when truly that we didn't actually really address it potentially, right? And so that's always the other thing that I want to touch on. The answer isn't always just dry it out, right? Step one, stop it. Step two, dry it out. Yes, you want to dry it out, but that doesn't mean that you stop the problem. You want to stop the moisture presence as fast as you can, because then that will stop the continuous growth of the mold, right? So it's stop the leak, dry out the water damaged materials. And then you start getting into trying to figure out, is there even a problem here or not, right? That's next step. So short answer, it's an inspection, it's testing in the right way. There's a lot to it, but to summarize it, it's validate that there is or there is not a problem there.
Mhm.
And so once you do that and you say, oh, this thing, there is something here, or there's not something here, then you can make your next decision and your next move. Do I need remediation? Do I not need remediation? How extensive do I need to get with this thing, and kind of go down that road?
No, I think that's a great point, because we hear that myth all the time, or people say, I don't see or smell mold, so it must not be a problem. And it's just unfortunately not that simple, as you said. This is
Honestly, real sorry to,
yeah, no,
nobody could see or smell COVID, guys.
right.
We saw what that did. Like it's
Right.
like fragmentation and spores and mycotoxins can be smaller than the size of a virus particle floating around. And that virus shut the world down for 2 years. So the I don't see it, I don't smell it thing, it's, stuff impacts us, right? That's how we get sick.
Right.
That's how we get colds. It's like how all this stuff happens.
So then tell people who may not be familiar, what is an IEP? That's what you are essentially. And why would someone hire an IEP before, say, a remediation company?
Yeah, so an IEP is an indoor environmental professional. I don't know who came up with the acronym, but they did. So that's what we do. So basically the concept is there's kind of 2 steps to this whole thing. So I kind of answer this question in almost like a larger sort of like story. Anybody who knows me knows I like analogies and stories. So there's 2 goals, like in any inspection, right? The first thing you have to do is you have to figure out where the source of the problem is. And then the second thing you need to do is figure out how that source has impacted other spaces in the home. And then once you get that piece, then remediation happens. So when you're asking your question, what's kind of the difference between an IEP and a remediator? Think of it like this. Think of it like Grey's Anatomy, right? You're watching like Grey's Anatomy, right? And you got Shepard, who's like the best brain surgeon that's ever been, right? But if he isn't getting the diagnostic testing that's telling him exactly where like the tumor is in the brain that he needs to get it out, or what he needs to do, what's he gonna do? Just cut your entire brain open and just start digging around trying to find it, right? Like that's what the remediator is. The remediator is cutting open stuff to remove things and clean things. But if they don't know where it is, that's the equivalent of you getting on an operating table and having the surgeon just cut you open from your neck to your stomach and say, let's go try to find something. Where's all the stuff?
Right.
The IEP is Meredith Grey. She is going in and she's like, oh my gosh, this is happening. This is how it moved. All we need to do is do this and this right here. And this is how we fix it. Give that to the surgeon. They go and fix that and that. And all of a sudden you've been treated by the best doctors in the world. And maybe you got a spin-off show. So that's it. So like in the world, I am Meredith Grey, I guess. The IEPs are Meredith Grey. And the surgeons are, Shepard or the surgeon or whoever it's going to be. Or the
so you're going in and diagnosing the home essentially.
Exactly.
And figuring out exactly where all the pain points are. Exactly. I like that.
Maybe I should have said that.
I love the analogies. Keep them coming. So now take us through a typical investigation, starting with that initial information you get over the phone from your clients to what the actual inspection looks like, what tools you use, what tests you use.
Yeah. All right. So there's kind of a flow to this. So the first thing, literally the most important thing, I don't want to say that. A very important thing in the inspection is understanding the history of what's gone on in a house. Now, some people will be like, oh, I just moved in this place. I don't know the history. That's fine. There's clues and things that will show us things, and that's okay, right? So I don't want to say like you have to know that. And if you don't know that, then you're screwed. That's not what we're saying. But the more that we know about what's gone on historically in a house, the more that we can look into potential things that may have stemmed off of that. So when I say what's happened in the house, history of the house, has there been not only bigger leaks? So most people think of like larger water things, right? I had a pipe leak, my basement water comes into it. Like I had my laundry machine flooded everywhere. Like that's usually where everybody's heads goes. So the first time I asked this question, you're like, oh, we haven't really had anything like that. I'm like, well, what about like a drip under a sink that you just tightened something and it got fixed? What about like bathrooms with your kids where they get out and you always kind of notice there's like maybe the baseboard next to the bathroom is a little weird compared to something else. Maybe you spilled something and you put a dryer on it in a couple out, and it took a few days to dry it and you didn't think it was like a water issue, right? So the first step is kind of redefining what we think like a water event is. An event makes it seem like such a big thing, but it's like, it could be such a tiny, tiny thing. And it could lead to a much larger problem that's going on. So the first step in the process and with my clients and our programs and stuff, before we even start talking about how you find stuff, It's how do you sort of take inventory of where you are, what's going on, what's happened before, and going on from that, right? So that's the first thing, because if you tell me, yeah, I had this water event, I had this thing that happened, and I'm like, okay, so what happened? What did you do? Like, oh, well, we dried it out, this and that. So in my mind, you had a pipe, let's say it's a pipe leak, whatever. You had a pipe leak in a wall. They went in, they fixed the leak. So I'll be like, what happened? Well, they came in, they fixed the leak. I'm like, okay, and then what else happened? Well, then they like patched it all up. I'm like, and then they dried it out and it took a few days.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So now that I know that that happened, what I know is before I even walk into this house, I'm doing a wall cavity test in that wall where that leak was to see if there's a hidden mold problem behind that wall as a result of that problem. So a lot of the planning we can kind of map out just from conversations that we're having. And then I send notes to my team, or our lead consultants who are running it will then send notes to the people who are in the field, right? And say, okay, when we go into this house, we're going to be working through this inspection together. But we know from the initial onboarding call that we want to test here, 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 and here in this way before we've even seen the place, because we have them describe it to us, right? So, and I think one of the biggest things that, and the reason that's so important is it ties around one of these big mold myths, is that if an area is dry, that there can't be any mold, right? And a lot of local inspectors say that, a lot of remediators will say that, your landlord will definitely say that.
Right.
And it's because, well, mold needs water to grow. Yes, mold needs water to grow. It doesn't need water to stay, right? Think of a plant growing in your yard. It needs water to grow. What if you stop watering it? It stays there. It just kind of wilts over, kind of dries up. It's, but it's there, So it's not like the plant is like smart enough to uproot itself and go search for a river somewhere where it can create like a neighborhood or whatever, right? And so that's the same thing with mold. Mold is no different than a plant growing, right? And so the problem is that when they dry out, these colonies become really brittle. And so like when you have a healthy colony and there's moisture and it's like there and its roots are in the ground, it's not going anywhere, it's releasing like spores off the top of the colony, it might be creating mycotoxins, so it might be actively kind of producing stuff, right? When the water goes away, the colony kind of shrivels up and it dries up, right? And it's not producing stuff anymore. But then what happens is that when air currents move through your house, so think about if you've ever opened a door and a door somewhere else shuts on its own, you're not haunted. It's an airflow thing, right? This is building science that's happening. And so it's a visual representation that there's air current and airflow that's slamming a door shut. Well, this happens in your house all the time. You open doors, your air conditioning system turns on, you run the dryer machine, you put on the exhaust fan in your bathroom. All of these little things that we don't think about, they impact the entire airflow circulation in the house. And so you have all these currents that are moving all the time. So if you have a colony that's dried up and an airflow piece comes by, it's going to shatter that thing into really tiny little pieces. And the thing about the pieces is that they get smaller, way smaller than the size of the spores that are actually created by a colony in the first place. And what that means is that they're more easily able to bypass the natural filtration system that our body has. Our nose filters stuff out, our throat filters stuff out before it gets to our lungs. It's a protective mechanism. The particles, when they get that small, they go right through all that stuff. They get into our lungs, they get into our bloodstream, and that's where you start getting like inflammatory responses, immune responses, things like that. So that's the first, I'm still on step one. So that's like the first step of kind of
this is great.
And why it's important, right? And so then the next thing is obviously we go in and we kind of do the assessment piece there, right? So when we're doing the assessment, we just talked about how most mold issues are not currently wet, right? Most things are dry, right? I live in a house that's 10 years old. I had my toilet leaked. There's a little stain on the baseboard behind my toilet. That happened 8 years ago. It's dry, right? We fixed the toilet ring, but that thing is still there. That can still be a problem. So there are clues, and we call them the 5 signs of hidden mold growth. There's 5 signs in any house, in any space that you go into, that are an indication that there's potentially been a water thing that's impacted that. And so what we're doing as we're going through, let me see if I can say them off the top of my head. It's so funny. I talk about them all the time. So there's bubbling. So think like bubbling paint or something like that.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I've seen that in houses before.
So you have to think, like, when you're looking through stuff and if you're looking at a wall and there's paint bubbling on it, you're like, why is there paint bubbling here? Don't just like walk by and be like, oh, the house is 20 years old. It's just the house. This happens with houses. This wall should not be bubbling for no reason. There's a reason
Right.
the wall is bubbling, right? So we have to start like thinking about it a little like that. So there's bubbling like that. There's cracking and peeling. Again, you can see that in paint. You can see both of these things in cabinetry. Happens a whole lot underneath sink cabinets, things like that. There's buckling and separating. So think like a baseboard's pulling off of a wall. A sink cabinet floor panels like bowed, flooring is bowed or buckled somewhere. So stuff like that. The fourth one is really more about around like kind of chemical reactions almost. So like rust, efflorescence, mineral deposits, things like that. So you'll see this more crawl spaces and basements. You'll see this a lot where if you look at the foundation walls, you'll see like this white powdery stuff on the walls. It looks like that means that water has come through and there's essentially been a mineral deposit and that's what's left, right? That doesn't mean that that's mold. That's not necessarily what that means. It just means that water has gotten in here at some point and there's like a footprint that's telling us that that's happened. And then the last thing is staining, like actual staining. You see water stain, it's a water stain, right? So these are the 5 things. Like, it's actually not incredibly hard to do what we do. You just have to kind of know how to do it, right? So the idea is that we go through a house, we're not just relying on like a moisture meter and an infrared camera because that's going to miss 90% of the things that are going on in your house. Because if something's not wet, moisture meter is not going to pick it up. Most things are not wet. If something isn't wet, your infrared camera isn't going to show a cold reading. And so you're going to infrared scan this thing and it's going to look totally fine. And you got these these inspectors, whatever you want to call them, coming in. And they're like, oh yeah, we got the infrareds and we got the moisture meters and we're going to do this. Like if literally all you're doing is relying on tools and you're not actually looking at anything, you're going to miss everything. You're going to miss it all. And so that's a really big piece of it. And then we get into, okay, how do we test, which is then the next part of your question, right? So like we go through, we identify these things. It's like, okay, so now how do we try to validate and figure stuff out? And this kind of goes to what I was talking about earlier, and then I spun off on a Grey's Anatomy tangent. But there's 2 goals in every inspection that you do. The first goal is to figure out where the source of the problem is. Where is it coming from? And then the second goal is try to understand how that source is impacting the rest of the space, which is how you're ultimately being exposed to it. So I use this analogy all the time that mold is like a factory. And the idea, let's say you move into a house, you live in a house, there's a factory over here. You live a half a mile down the road over here, right? So in the factory, they're making whatever they're making, they're doing whatever they're doing. There's walls surrounding the factory, right? Like you drive down the street, there's a factory. You can't see what they're doing, but then you look at the top and the smokestack at the top and there's smoke coming out of the top of the factory, right? So they're making something inside and the byproduct of what they're making is smoke coming out of these smokestacks out of the factory, okay? Now we live in this house over here a half a mile down the road. You walk out into your front yard and you have all this air pollution that's basically been created by that factory, and you breathe in this air pollution, right? So now somebody might say to you, oh man, you live in a place with a really bad air pollution problem. You should move, right? I mean, yeah, kind of. We have a bad air pollution problem, but that's not the real problem. The problem is the factory that's creating the air pollution, right? If you shut this factory down, if I fired everybody, if I bulldoze the whole thing down, whatever, and it's not in operation anymore, there's no more smoke coming out, okay? So that's step 1. Step 1 is where are the factories and what do we need to do in order to shut them down? Typically that means remediation. You have to remove a source in order for that to happen. Now the second piece is what do you do with all the smoke that's up here, right? So again, the stuff isn't as smart as we think it is, right? Like it's not like we shut down the factory and all the smoke is like, oh crap, we're not supposed to be out here. And then it like sucks itself back into the factory to get out of the way. If it's out, it's out. Right? And this is what happens in our house. If we have mold issues that are the factory source level issue, what's going on, it's releasing these particles when they break apart and spores and toxins. And that's getting into the living space through these air currents that we talked about, right? So that's moving it all into the airspace. That is the air pollution in our house now, right? So even, and this is honestly one of the biggest mistakes that happens in remediation. Even if you have a great inspection, you find all the sources, which oftentimes doesn't happen, but let's say that it did. Let's say you found every source and you removed, X walls and this and that in order to get rid of these factories. That's usually where remediators stop.
Right,
Oh,
right.
we remove the mold. It's good, ready to go. what about all the smoke that's still through the house, which is actually what you were reacting to in the first place anyways. The sources where it came from, your reaction and your exposure was from that secondary kind of movement off of the source. So what happens a lot is that people spend a bunch of money on remediation. They come in, rip out a bunch of stuff, do the work. Now listen, whether or not the remediation was good is for another day, right? Like how to do that.
Well, let's say, have to do more. There's so much we could talk about.
I know. So let's say they did it right, okay? And you spend, 10, 15, 20 grand, whatever the number is to remediate. You come back in, you're going to probably be feeling the same way you were feeling before, because the exposure piece, the air pollution that was floating around your house, it wasn't removed. It's still there. So the second piece of an inspection then is to understand what is the composition of that air pollution, right? And we do this through dust testing. Dust, and there's a bunch of studies on this now too. It's just dust, it accumulates all of this, gets resuspended into our breathing zone, the microbial diversity in dust, the toxins that build up in dust, of everything that happens, it sits there. And then as we move through the house, there's this concept called the human cloud effect. So like if you ever saw Charlie Brown as a kid and there's a super dirty kid that just had dirt around him all the time, that actually happens to us as we walk through our house, except it's an invisible particle that we can't see, right? So we have this cloud. I sit in my chair, I bump my desk, I do whatever, that's constantly following us all over the place. What's the composition of that particle? Is what's following me all over the place have toxic, mycotoxins and endotoxins in it? Is there a massive mold load that's in it or not, right? And so the second piece of the whole thing is then we have to clean the entire house in a very systematic way that gets these tiny particles out of the house. So then all the work that we did by removing the sources, so we're not adding to it anymore, right? So we're not adding into that smoke and everything. And then we remove the smoke and now we've got a clean slate and we don't have any sources feeding back into it. And we don't have any residual leftover that's sitting around the house. And this is how people get back in their house and they start to heal. And that's kind of the big flow, kind of like start to finish.
No, I love that. And, the way you frame it, it seems obvious, right? You're looking for signs of water damage. I'm not necessarily looking for mold. Yet I know all the inspectors I've had, that's not what they do. They go through the house kind of quickly and they'll take maybe a thermal camera. And your approach is really smart. It's different. It's looking at historical water damage, whether it's still wet or dry, and piecing together those clues. And I know that is profound, even though it probably shouldn't be, but it's such good information for people to have.
It's so similar to like functional medicine. It really is. Like the way that you address your house should be like, if somebody's listening to this, they're probably dealing with a health issue. They're probably either working with or looking for an integrative doc or a functional doc. The way that they work through what's going on with you, the whole concept of root cause, what's causing it, what's the cascade that's happening after that, right? Like what secondary triggers are happening, what's going on. It's exactly how you go through a house. The house is a living, breathing system. It has lungs. The ventilation system is the lungs. It has air, and then we are in it and we are part of that ecosystem. And the way that you look at them is exactly the same. It should be exactly the same.
Right.
What's causing the problem? What's the secondary effect that's then being created by that root cause of the problem? And what's the order of events that we do to address them in the right way so we stop that and reduce that problem? It's the same method in the medical side. It's just, nobody really thinks of it that way on the environmental side.
Yeah, no, that's so important. I know we're going to be wrapping up here in just a minute. And so one of the questions I want to ask you is, what is something that you do for your family in terms of prevention to keep your family safe and your home free from water damage and mold as much as possible?
Yeah, a couple things. So one, obviously I look around and I feel like I'm in the matrix looking at everything all the time. Yeah. So but you don't have to be like that, right? Like if you know what these signs of water damage are, you could do some of this stuff. The easiest thing that anybody can do, pull everything out of your sinks every month, your sink cabinets. Look down there. Are there drip stains? Are there this? Is there little bubbles? And keep in mind, I just did a training for my private group on this earlier today, but like really, really little bubbles, little stains can mean massive problems on the back end, right underneath it. And is this video what you're going to be showing?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Can I share my screen?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me give you a screen sharing capabilities here. Sorry about that. You should be good to go.
All right. I'm going to show you guys my sink cabinet in a townhouse that I lived in a while ago. So actually, I want to hide the reveal. There we go. All right. So this is it. Are you seeing this?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Okay. Just the cabinet, right? You're not seeing all my other things.
I can see some other stuff, but mostly your cabinet. You can see your desktop.
Do it like this. All right. Okay, this was my sink cabinet in a townhouse. Obviously, it's in remediation now, so spoiler alert, there's a problem. So when you're looking at this, okay, the cabinet's laying face down. So the doors of the cabinet are like here, right on the front. And then this is where you set all of your products and stuff, right? This floor of the cabinet. And this would be against the back wall. So we could see here that this is all like dark and stuff and whatever, but that was against the back wall. Like I couldn't see that when I was looking at it.
Oh, wow.
Right? So the only thing that I could see if I looked under the sink was this little water stain. That was it. This is the only thing that was here. And so it's a minimal thing, but we understand this idea of signs of hidden mold growth. And you know, I didn't throw the Titanic analogy, so I'll throw that real quick. It wasn't the tip of the iceberg that sunk the Titanic. They got around that part of it, right? It was the massive freaking ice structure underneath the water that they ran into. This is the tip of the iceberg. This gets confused and overlooked by local inspectors all the time, the same way that the people driving the Titanic were like, oh, that's no problem. We're just going to do this thing and it's no big deal.
Right.
Right?
You know how that story ended.
See, exactly, right? So what we did, so I tested this cabinet. Actually, can I do it this way? And then this is what the bottom of my cabinet looked like.
Oh gosh. And you couldn't see any of that.
You couldn't see any of this. All I had was one little water stain that anybody locally, most likely, I don't want to like lump everyone in there, but most inspectors are the same, would have been like, oh, it's a sink, that's normal. It's a little stain there. It's dry right now. There's no mold growing in here. It's fine. Sinks drip. What are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it? Make sure your sinks don't drip. Like that's what you do about it. So this is it. So this is a big example of why you want to look under your sinks. And when I say look under your sinks, you're not looking for this massive thing that's happening here. You're looking for this. If that's a thing, if you see a little stain, a little bubble, a little something, then we need to be testing that stuff, right? You need to look under there and test that thing. So part of it is being aware of kind of like the high water sort of plumbing areas, some super easy things. So under sinks, near showers, tubs, around toilets. So the baseboards around toilets, the flooring around toilets, depending on what kind of flooring you have, sometimes the flooring will get discolored because the moisture discolors it. If you have tile, it's a little more difficult to see because it doesn't show it as much. But those are like some basic things of just like, I could go through my house every couple weeks, however long. I have 7 sinks, I have 3 tubs, I'm just throwing numbers out there, and I have, you know, 5 toilets. Just go look around those. Just go look around that stuff, right? Because honestly, when we go into homes, those are like, every house has something kind of happening there, it feels like. So those are like hotspot things, right? Now, the other couple of things you can do for prevention is under your sinks, don't just go under there and hope that water didn't drip on it, right? You can get inserts that go under your sinks. I have one under every single one of my sinks.
Me too.
I fall victim to this too. I moved into this house that we're renting now 2 years ago. I have this list of things. I need to get these things for under the sinks. I need to do this. And then life happens and you got kids and you got this. And so I forget to get the protectors for under the sinks. I go under my sink and damn it, there was a drip leak under my sink. And thankfully I had like a box or something under like one of my product things, and it only hit that and nothing else. And so it didn't impact the structure of the sink, the cabinet at all. I didn't have to like remediate anything, but man, that thing was moldy, right? Yeah. I didn't look at it often enough, and I didn't put something under there to protect the sink from it. And it almost really screwed me. And I literally tell people to do this every day, right? So like, we're allowed to make mistakes. We're allowed to have life come in the way, right? That happens for everybody. But like, it happened to me and I was like, bam, I have to order these right away. Now every sink in my house has one of these. And of course, there's never been a leak since then, but that's fine because one day there probably will be. And these things can hold like up to a gallon of water, essentially,
Right.
in them without it impacting space. So it's a really, really easy thing that you can do in a super high, like water traffic kind of area. And sink cabinets are so just common. The other thing that I have for prevention in the house, every single room that is any room that we spend any time in has an air filter in it.
Mm-hmm.
And not one of these like Walmart, Costco air filters in it. Like we have like high-end medical grade air filters because I mean, we're only talking about mold right now. I know Change the Air is more about mold. This is like mold specific. If you guys knew the crap that was behind your walls, and if you had seen a wall opened up and see the dead rodents back there and the droppings and the termites over here and all this stuff, there's way more, not to mention the VOCs off of all of your stuff that gets into the dust and all that stuff that moves around. There is so much going on in a house. Like for me now, if somebody came to me and is like, hey, if I go to someone's house, like literally, and they're like, hey, do you want some water? I'm like, yeah. And then I see them go to the tap. I'm like, hey, no, I'm cool. I'm not gonna drink that.
Yeah, sure.
Right? Like that's, I just am never gonna drink tap water. Like it's just gross to think about, like all that stuff. Our house is just as gross as that pipe where the water's coming out of it, everything that's back there. And so these filters, obviously the mold piece is a piece of it, right? Now, luckily we don't have like significant mold issues. So you'd be like, well, why do you have these if that's what you're doing? It's for all the other stuff, right? And when I open these things to change them, they are black, they are covered. And imagine instead of it being there, it being in your kids' lungs and your lungs, whatever, right? So that's another big thing. I've got an office, my bedroom, my two kids' bedrooms. We have kind of like a kitchen living area like most people have or whatever. And then we have a little gym that we set up in the garage. I've one out there too. I have 6 in my house.
Yeah.
Every space that we spend time in has one of these things that are constantly trying to clean the air.
Yeah, I love it. I know we're out of time. And so you're going to have to come back and we're going to have to dig into some of these topics more. But the big takeaway for everyone today is write down those 5 signs of water damage on a Post-it note, go through your house top to bottom and make note of those areas, and then call a good IEP to come help you out. And maybe we can pick up next time talking a little bit more about testing and how you go about that. For anyone listening, tell them how they can find you or more about you.
So on Instagram, our handle is at Mold Finders. That's kind of where a bulk of things happen. It's kind of like the main stuff where everything's happening. I also have my podcast. I forgot, there's so many things. So my podcast is called Mold Finders Radio. I talk like this. So if you like the way I talk, there's a whole lot more of it. There's 100+ episodes of it and it keeps going. So all kinds of like super awesome, free, useful information. And then there's other ways. My company is called We Inspect, right? Sometimes there's a confusion between Mold Finders and We Inspect. That's just my Instagram handle. I find it. We Inspect is our company. Yes, weinspect.com. We could work with people in different ways. So if you want someone to come to your house, we can do that. We're nationwide. We literally go anywhere. So if you're like, I don't have anyone good locally, consider us local. We can be there. And then also we also have a private consulting group that kind of allows us to sort of coach you through this whole process, different ways that we can work with you. So if you're interested, you could go there and that will kind of start the process. I
love it. And you're going to be doing a lot with Change the Air going forward, taking over our emails, helping us out with posts and stuff. So thank you so much, Brian, for joining us today.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
No problem. We'll see you next time.
All right. Bye-bye.
So much. Bye-bye.